The summer sun blazed mercilessly over the coastal plain of Acre in August 1191. On the dusty ground outside the city walls, nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners sat bound and helpless, surrounded by the armored knights and soldiers of England's King Richard III. What happened next would echo through the centuries as one of the most controversial military decisions of the medieval period, a mass execution that would cement Richard's reputation as both a brilliant warrior and a ruthless commander willing to pursue victory at any cost. This was Richard the Lionheart, the legendary Crusader king whose name has become synonymous with medieval chivalry, martial prowess, and the clash of civilizations during the Third Crusade. Yet the man behind the legend was far more complex and far more brutal than the romanticized tales suggest. His decade-long reign from 1189 to 1199 transformed him into one of history's most celebrated military commanders, but it also revealed a calculating pragmatist who could order mass killings without hesitation when strategic necessity demanded it. To understand the real Richard requires stripping away centuries of myth-making and confronting the uncomfortable truths about medieval warfare, the Crusades, and the man who became their most iconic champion. This is not the story of a noble knight fighting for God and glory. It is the story of a sophisticated military strategist, a political opportunist, and a warrior king whose actions in the Holy Land would leave an indelible mark on Christian-Muslim relations for generations to come. The making of a warrior king, Richard was born on September 8, 1157, in Oxford, England, the third son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. From the beginning, his destiny was shaped by the violent politics of the Angevin Empire, a vast collection of territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. His childhood was not spent in peaceful contemplation, but in the harsh realities of medieval statecraft, where sons plotted against fathers and brothers warred against brothers for lands and titles. Eleanor of Aquitaine was perhaps the most powerful woman in 12th century Europe, and she recognized in Richard a martial talent that surpassed his brothers. While his elder brother Henry was groomed for the English throne, and his younger brother Geoffrey learned the arts of diplomacy, Richard was given control of his mother's ancestral lands in Aquitaine at the age of 11. This was no ceremonial gift. Aquitaine was a turbulent region filled with rebellious nobles who respected only strength and military prowess. By his teenage years, Richard was already leading military campaigns against recalcitrant vassals. He learned warfare not from books, but from brutal experience, mastering siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and the psychological dimensions of medieval combat. Chronicles from the period describe a young man who was physically imposing, tall, with reddish-blonde hair and piercing eyes, and possessed of seemingly limitless energy and courage in battle. The formative moment of Richard's early life came in 1173 when he joined his brothers in a great rebellion against their father, King Henry II. This conflict, fueled by Eleanor's resentment of her husband's infidelities and the son's impatience for real power, tore the Angevin Empire apart. Though the rebellion ultimately failed and Eleanor was imprisoned for her role, Richard learned crucial lessons about loyalty, betrayal, and the ruthless calculus of medieval politics. He also discovered his own capacity for violence. During the suppression of revolts in Aquitaine, he earned a reputation for brutally crushing resistance, burning castles, and showing little mercy to those who defied him. By the 1180s, Richard had become one of the most feared military commanders in Europe. His campaigns in Aquitaine and his wars against his brother Henry, and then his father established patterns that would define his kingship: rapid mobilization of forces, aggressive offensive operations, sophisticated use of siege engines and fortifications, and an unwillingness to accept anything less than complete victory. He was not a king who ruled from a throne room, but a warrior who led from the front, often fighting alongside his knights and exposing himself to considerable personal danger. When Henry II died in 1189, exhausted and defeated by Richard's relentless military pressure, Richard ascended to the English throne at age 31. He had already been a duke and military commander for 2 decades. The crown merely gave him greater resources to pursue his true passion: warfare on a grand scale. The call to crusade. Richard's coronation in September 1189 came at a moment of crisis for Christendom. 2 years earlier, the Muslim commander Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to Europeans as Saladin, had inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Crusader armies at the Battle of Hattin. In a single day, July 4, 1187, Saladin had destroyed the military power of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, captured the True Cross relic, and opened the way for the reconquest of the Holy Land. Within months, Jerusalem itself fell to Muslim forces for the first time since 1099. The shockwaves reverberated throughout Christian Europe. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing the news. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade to reclaim Christianity's holiest sites. The Third Crusade would be the largest military expedition since the First Crusade nearly a century earlier. For Richard, the crusade represented both a spiritual calling and a magnificent opportunity. Medieval kings were expected to demonstrate piety, and what greater demonstration could there be than taking up the cross to liberate Jerusalem? But Richard was also a pragmatist who recognized the political advantages. A successful crusade would enhance his prestige throughout Christendom, distract potentially rebellious nobles with foreign warfare, and perhaps even expand his own territories in the East. The financial preparation for the crusade was staggering. Richard famously declared that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. He sold offices, lands, and privileges to raise money. He levied the Saladin tithe, a 10% tax on income and movable property throughout his domains. Monasteries and churches were pressured to contribute their treasures. By the time Richard departed in 1190, he had assembled what contemporaries described as the largest war chest ever accumulated by an English king. The army Richard led was similarly impressive. Contemporary estimates vary wildly, as medieval chroniclers were notoriously unreliable with numbers, but modern historians estimate Richard commanded approximately 8,000 soldiers, including perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 knights and mounted soldiers, plus thousands of infantry, crossbowmen, and support personnel. His fleet numbered around 100 ships, making it one of the largest naval forces of the medieval period. Richard did not rush immediately to the Holy Land. His journey became a military campaign in its own right. While sailing through the Mediterranean, his fleet stopped at Sicily, where Richard became embroiled in local politics. When the local king refused to honor agreements, Richard besieged and captured Messina in a lightning campaign that showcased his tactical brilliance. He then spent the winter in Sicily, demonstrating the same lack of urgency that would characterize much of his reign. Richard was never in a hurry when his own interests were at stake. In spring 1191, another detour proved even more consequential. Richard's ships were scattered by storms, and several were wrecked on Cyprus. The island's ruler, Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine rebel who had declared himself emperor, seized the shipwrecked survivors and their treasure. This proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Richard invaded Cyprus with overwhelming force, conquered the entire island in less than a month, and added its considerable wealth to his war chest. Cyprus would remain in Crusader hands for centuries, providing a crucial supply base for operations in the Holy Land. Arrival at Acre. The siege begins. When Richard finally arrived at Acre in June 1191, he found a military situation that had stalemated into a grueling siege. The city of Acre, a vital port on the coast of modern-day Israel, had been under siege by Crusader forces for nearly 2 years. The Christian army, led by King Guy of Lusignan of Jerusalem and various European nobles, had surrounded the city, but lacked the strength to take it by assault. Meanwhile, Saladin's army surrounded the Crusaders, creating a bizarre double siege where neither side could achieve decisive victory. The arrival of Richard and Philip Augustus of France, who had reached Acre weeks earlier, transformed the strategic situation. Suddenly, the Crusaders possessed the resources, the siege, equipment, and the leadership to break the stalemate. Richard, despite being seriously ill with a fever that may have been scurvy or malaria, immediately took charge of the military operations with characteristic energy. Richard's approach to siege warfare demonstrated the sophisticated military engineering of the late 12th century. He deployed massive trebuchets and mangonels, stone-throwing siege engines capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds, to batter Acre's walls day and night. He ordered the construction of siege towers and protected galleries that allowed his soldiers to approach the fortifications under cover. He even paid his soldiers bonuses for every stone they removed from the wall, creating a competitive system that maintained morale during the grinding siege work. The psychological pressure was equally important. Richard ensured his banners and those of other Crusader leaders were prominently displayed, sending a clear message to the defenders that they now faced the full might of Western Christendom. He negotiated constantly, offering terms of surrender while simultaneously demonstrating his willingness to destroy the city completely if necessary. The defenders of Acre, approximately 3,000 soldiers plus civilians, found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. Saladin's relief efforts proved insufficient. His army could harass the Crusaders, but could not break through their lines to resupply the city. By early July, starvation and disease had weakened the garrison to the point where further resistance became futile. On July 12, 1191, after nearly 2 years of siege, Acre surrendered. The terms were negotiated carefully. The garrison would be spared in exchange for a substantial ransom of 200,000 dinars, the return of the True Cross captured at Hattin, and the release of 1,500 Christian prisoners held by Saladin. The defenders would be held as hostages until these conditions were met. The fall of Acre represented a major strategic victory for the Crusaders. They had secured a vital port that could supply further operations, demonstrated their ability to defeat Saladin's forces, and restored momentum to their campaign. For Richard personally, it was a triumph that established his dominance over the Crusades' leadership. Philip Augustus, his nominal equal, departed for France shortly after, leaving Richard as the unquestioned commander of Christian forces in the Holy Land. But the victory celebration would soon give way to one of the most controversial episodes of Richard's reign: the massacre at Acre. The initial euphoria of victory quickly soured as the agreed-upon terms of surrender began to unravel. Saladin, whose forces had withdrawn to a safe distance after Acre's fall, faced his own complications in meeting Richard's demands. The return of the True Cross, the payment of the enormous ransom, and the exchange of prisoners all required time to organize. Saladin requested an extension of the deadline, which Richard reluctantly granted. But Richard's patience was not infinite. He was eager to continue his campaign toward Jerusalem, and every day spent waiting at Acre was a day lost to the season's campaigning weather. His army consumed vast quantities of supplies, and maintaining a force of thousands in the field was enormously expensive. Moreover, Richard faced pressure from his own knights and soldiers who wanted to move forward, to fight, to fulfill their crusading vows. By mid-August, nearly a month after Acre's surrender, Saladin had still not fully complied with the surrender terms. He had sent a first installment of the ransom, but had not produced the true cross or all the promised prisoners. Whether this delay was due to practical difficulties in assembling such resources, or whether Saladin was deliberately stalling to keep Richard pinned at Acre, remains debated by historians. What is clear is that Richard interpreted the delay as a breach of the agreement. On August 20th, 1191, Richard made his decision. He ordered the mass execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and children, who had been held as hostages since the city's surrender. The massacre was carried out methodically. The prisoners were marched outside the city walls in full view of Saladin's army, positioned on the nearby hills. There, they were systematically killed by sword and spear. Contemporary chroniclers described the scene with varying degrees of horror and justification. The Muslim historian Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was present with Saladin's army, wrote of the anguish and fury that swept through the Muslim forces as they watched helplessly from a distance. Christian chroniclers like Roger of Howden and Richard of Devizes provided more clinical accounts, presenting the execution as a necessary military decision rather than an atrocity. The immediate military logic of Richard's action was clear. He could not afford to leave thousands of enemy combatants behind his lines as he advanced toward Jerusalem. They would need to be guarded by soldiers Richard needed for his offensive. He could not release them, as they would rejoin Saladin's army. The ransom was not forthcoming, and Richard had lost faith in Saladin's willingness or ability to meet the surrender terms. From a purely pragmatic military perspective, the prisoners had become a liability that the execution eliminated. Yet even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare, the scale of the killing was shocking. Mass executions of garrison soldiers who had surrendered under terms were relatively rare in the Crusades. Most commanders, including Saladin himself, typically exchanged or ransomed prisoners because dead enemies had no value while living ones could be traded or sold. Richard's decision broke with this norm and created a precedent that would haunt Christian-Muslim relations for the remainder of the crusade. Saladin's response was swift and harsh. In the days following the Acre massacre, Muslim forces executed their own Christian prisoners in retaliation. The cycle of atrocity and counter-atrocity, always present in the Crusades, escalated to new levels. More importantly, the massacre eliminated any possibility of a negotiated settlement between Richard and Saladin. The two leaders would meet face-to-face multiple times during the campaign, and they developed a mutual respect that bordered on admiration. But the bloodstain of Acre ensured that compromise would be extraordinarily difficult. The march south, military genius on display. Having dealt with the prisoners in his characteristically brutal fashion, Richard immediately pivoted to his next objective: the southward march to Jaffa, a port city that would serve as a staging area for the final push toward Jerusalem. This campaign, conducted in August and September 1191, would showcase Richard's military genius at its finest and cement his reputation as one of the greatest tactical commanders of the medieval period. The march from Acre to Jaffa covered approximately 80 miles along the Mediterranean coast. This may seem a modest distance, but in the context of medieval warfare, it represented an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking. Richard's army would be marching through hostile territory, constantly harassed by Saladin's forces in the blazing heat of a Levantine summer, while maintaining supply lines and cohesion. Richard's solution demonstrated sophisticated military thinking. He organized his army in a tight formation that prioritized defensive strength over speed. The baggage train and vulnerable supply wagons marched along the coast, protected on one side by the sea and Richard's fleet, which sailed parallel to the army and provided constant resupply. On the inland side, Richard deployed his infantry in dense formations, particularly his crossbowmen, who were arguably the most effective troops against Muslim cavalry. Behind the infantry screen rode the heavy cavalry, the armored knights who represented the Crusaders' primary offensive capability. Richard kept these troops fresh and ready for decisive action, refusing to be baited into the premature cavalry charges that had destroyed previous Crusader armies. This required extraordinary discipline, as Muslim horse archers constantly harassed the column, launching arrows and attempting to provoke the knights into breaking formation. Saladin understood the threat Richard posed and was determined to destroy the Crusader army before it could reach Jaffa. He shadowed the Christian force with his entire army, launching constant attacks designed to disrupt the march, inflict casualties, and create chaos. Muslim cavalry would dash forward, loose arrows at close range, and retreat before the heavily armored Crusaders could respond. The psychological pressure on Richard's soldiers must have been immense, marching for hours under a storm of arrows, watching comrades fall, unable to strike back. Richard's leadership during this march was crucial. He personally rode up and down the column, maintaining discipline, encouraging his troops, and ensuring that his careful formation held together. When local commanders wanted to launch counterattacks, Richard refused, insisting on maintaining the defensive formation until the decisive moment arrived. The Battle of Arsuf, crushing victory. That moment came on September 7, 1191, at Arsuf, a small town about 30 miles north of Jaffa. Saladin had decided to force a major battle, committing his entire army to a massive assault designed to break the Crusader formation once and for all. The Muslim attack was intense and sustained, with thousands of cavalry striking again and again at the Christian lines. Richard's army endured this punishment for hours, maintaining their disciplined march while absorbing terrible casualties. The Knights Hospitaller, forming the rearguard, suffered particularly heavily and sent repeated messages to Richard begging for permission to counterattack. Richard refused, waiting for the perfect moment when Saladin's forces would be fully committed and vulnerable. Finally, when he judged the moment right, or possibly when the Hospitallers could no longer restrain themselves and charged without orders, Richard unleashed his heavy cavalry in a devastating counterattack. The armored knights, fresh and furious from hours of passive defense, crashed into the Muslim cavalry with overwhelming force. The impact was catastrophic for Saladin's army. Medieval heavy cavalry charges represented one of the most terrifying military experiences of the period. Hundreds of armored warriors on massive war horses, moving in tight formation at full gallop, created an impact that could shatter infantry formations and scatter lighter cavalry. At Arsuf, Richard's charge broke through Saladin's lines and sent the Muslim army reeling in retreat. The Battle of Arsuf was not a complete annihilation. Saladin's forces were too mobile and well led to be destroyed entirely. But it was a decisive tactical victory that demonstrated Richard's superior battlefield command. Saladin had committed his best troops to destroying the Crusader army and had been comprehensively defeated. The psychological impact on both armies was profound. Muslim morale plummeted, while the Crusaders' confidence in their king soared. Contemporary estimates of casualties vary wildly, as usual with medieval sources, but modern historians suggest the Muslims may have suffered several thousand casualties compared to perhaps several hundred for the Crusaders. More importantly, Richard had achieved his operational objective. His army reached Jaffa intact and ready for further operations. The road not taken. Jerusalem. With Jaffa secured and Saladin's army temporarily broken, Richard faced the decision that would define his crusade, whether to march on Jerusalem itself. The Holy City lay less than 50 miles inland, through difficult terrain, but within striking distance for an army that had just demonstrated its superiority in open battle. The entire purpose of the Third Crusade had been to reclaim Jerusalem. Richard's men were eager to fulfill their crusading vows. The political and religious prestige of capturing the city would be immense. Yet Richard hesitated. Over the following months, he would advance toward Jerusalem twice, coming within sight of the city, only to withdraw both times without launching an assault. This decision remains controversial among historians and was bitterly criticized by many contemporaries who saw it as a failure of will or faith. But Richard's reasoning reflected cold military logic. Jerusalem was a strong fortress, and siege warfare was time-consuming and expensive. Even if Richard captured the city, holding it would require maintaining a garrison and supply lines through hostile territory. Saladin's army, though defeated at Arsuf, remained a potent force that could isolate Jerusalem and starve out its defenders. Richard had learned from the earlier Crusader states that spectacular conquests meant nothing if they could not be sustained. Moreover, Richard faced political pressures from home. His brother John was maneuvering for power in England, and Philip Augustus of France, having returned from the Crusade, was threatening Richard's territories in Normandy. Every month Richard spent in the Holy Land was a month his enemies could consolidate power in Europe. Instead of risking everything on a siege of Jerusalem, Richard adopted a different strategy. He would secure the coastal regions, rebuild the fortifications, and create a sustainable Crusader presence that could serve as a base for future operations. This was less glorious than conquering Jerusalem, but more likely to produce lasting results. The War of Attrition. The months following Arsuf devolved into a grinding war of attrition. Richard rebuilt the fortifications of Ascalon, a strategic coastal city that Saladin had demolished to prevent the Crusaders from using it. He launched raids into the interior, demonstrating his ability to strike anywhere in the region. He negotiated constantly with Saladin, proposing various compromise solutions that would give the Christians access to Jerusalem while acknowledging Muslim control. These negotiations revealed the complex relationship between Richard and Saladin. Despite the massacre at Acre and the brutal warfare, the two leaders developed a remarkable mutual respect. They exchanged gifts, sent messages praising each other's chivalry, and treated each other as honorable enemies rather than infidels. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent his personal physician. When Saladin's brother suffered from fever, Richard sent his own doctors. This personal rapport never translated into political agreement, however. Saladin could not surrender Jerusalem without betraying his position as defender of Islam. Richard could not return to Europe without some significant achievement to justify the enormous cost of the crusade. The two men were trapped by their respective political realities, unable to find common ground despite their personal respect. The military stalemate continued through 1192. Richard launched a second advance toward Jerusalem in June, coming within 12 miles of the city. Once again, after consulting with his military commanders who emphasized the difficulty of holding Jerusalem even if captured, he withdrew. This second retreat created serious morale problems in the Crusader army. Many soldiers and knights felt betrayed, believing Richard had abandoned the Crusade's sacred mission out of political calculation. In July 1192, another crisis emerged when Saladin's forces surprised and captured Jaffa, threatening to undo much of Richard's previous success. Richard responded with characteristic audacity. Taking only a small force, perhaps 80 knights and several hundred infantry, he sailed directly to Jaffa and launched an amphibious assault on the city. In a spectacular display of personal courage and tactical skill, Richard's tiny force recaptured Jaffa and drove out Saladin's army. The defense of Jaffa in August 1192 became legendary. Saladin attempted to retake the city with his full army, launching a surprise attack at dawn. Richard, with perhaps 2,000 defenders, most of them infantry, formed his forces outside the city walls and repelled multiple cavalry charges through sheer discipline and the effective use of crossbows and spearmen. At one point, Richard personally led a cavalry countercharge with only a handful of knights, driving back Muslim cavalry through the force of his presence and reputation. The treaty and departure. These final dramatic actions demonstrated that Richard could still win battles, but they did not change the fundamental strategic reality. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Richard's army was exhausted, depleted by casualties and disease, and increasingly demoralized by the failure to reach Jerusalem. Saladin's forces, while numerous, had been repeatedly defeated in open battle and could not drive the Crusaders from the coast. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin finally agreed to a peace treaty. The Treaty of Jaffa was a compromise that satisfied neither side completely, but acknowledged the military stalemate. The Crusaders retained control of the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa, providing a viable territorial base for the remaining Crusader states. Muslim pilgrims would be allowed to visit Jerusalem's holy sites without hindrance. Christian pilgrims would be granted safe passage to Jerusalem, though the city remained under Muslim control. The treaty was scheduled to last 3 years, though both sides understood it was more of a temporary truce than a permanent peace. Richard had secured significant territorial gains and restored the viability of the Crusader states, but he had failed in his primary objective of reclaiming Jerusalem. For Saladin, the treaty represented a strategic victory. He had preserved Muslim control of Jerusalem while absorbing the best military effort Western Christendom could muster. On October 9, 1192, Richard departed the Holy Land, never to return. His crusade had lasted 16 months of active campaigning, during which he had demonstrated brilliant tactical leadership, won every significant battle he fought, and secured important territorial gains. He had also ordered one of the largest mass executions of the crusade, established a reputation for ruthlessness that shocked even medieval contemporaries, and failed to achieve the Crusade's stated goal of liberating Jerusalem. The journey home would prove nearly as eventful as the crusade itself. Richard's ship was wrecked in the Adriatic, forcing him to attempt an overland journey through hostile territory. He was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom Richard had insulted during the crusade, and was turned over to Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. Richard spent more than a year in captivity before a massive ransom secured his release in 1194. The historical legacy, the number 50,000 that appears in popular accounts of Richard's crusade, is a significant exaggeration typical of medieval chronicle tradition. The actual number killed at Acre was approximately 2,700 prisoners, still a substantial atrocity, but far below the inflated figures that circulated in later centuries. Over the entire course of the Third Crusade, total casualties on all sides likely numbered in the tens of thousands, including deaths from battle, disease, starvation, and execution. This numerical inflation is itself historically significant. The tendency to exaggerate numbers in accounts of the Crusades reflects the propaganda purposes these narratives served. Christian chroniclers inflated enemy casualties to emphasize Richard's military prowess and God's favor toward the crusade. Muslim chroniclers sometimes inflated Christian atrocities to demonstrate infidel cruelty. Later Romantic traditions inflated everything to make the Crusades seem more epic and world-shaking than they actually were. The real historical impact of Richard's crusade was more subtle than simple body counts suggest. Militarily, Richard demonstrated that Western European heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry, when properly commanded, could defeat the more mobile forces of the Muslim East. His campaigns influenced military thinking for generations, establishing tactical principles that would be studied and emulated by later commanders. Politically, the Third Crusade stabilized the Crusader states for another century. The coastal territories Richard secured provided a viable base for future crusading efforts and maintained a Christian presence in the Holy Land until the final collapse in 1291. Without Richard's successes, the Crusader states might have disappeared entirely in the 1190s. Culturally, Richard became the archetypal Crusader king, embodying both the glory and the brutality of the age. His legend grew rapidly after his death in 1199 from an infected crossbow wound suffered while besieging a minor castle in France. An ignominious end for such a legendary warrior. Within decades, Richard was appearing in romances and legends as the perfect Christian knight, the noble warrior fighting for God and glory. This romanticized image obscured the real Richard, the calculating military commander who ordered mass executions when convenient, who spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England, who bankrupted his kingdom to fund foreign wars, and who ultimately failed to achieve his primary strategic objective. Modern historians have worked to strip away these legends and reveal a more complex figure. Understanding medieval warfare and morality. To fairly assess Richard's actions, we must understand the context of medieval warfare and medieval moral reasoning about violence. The Middle Ages operated under very different assumptions about legitimate violence than modern international law. The concept of war crimes did not exist. The laws of war, such as they were, came from a combination of Christian theology, chivalric codes that applied primarily to interactions among the nobility, and pragmatic customs that developed to make warfare less catastrophic for all involved. The execution of garrison soldiers who had surrendered under terms violated these customs, but was not unprecedented. Throughout the Crusades and other medieval conflicts, commanders sometimes ordered executions of prisoners for various reasons: to intimidate other garrisons, to eliminate security threats, as retaliation for perceived betrayals, or simply because feeding and guarding prisoners was expensive and inconvenient. What made the Acre massacre notable was its scale and the violation of an explicit surrender agreement. Most medieval commanders, including many during the Crusades, honored surrender terms even with enemies they despised. This was partly moral principle, partly Christian teaching about mercy, and partly pragmatic calculation. Garrisons that believed they would be massacred if they surrendered would fight to the death, making sieges longer and bloodier for everyone. Richard's decision to order the execution, despite the surrender terms, suggests he valued expedience over reputation. He was willing to accept the moral condemnation and the practical consequences, a hardening of Muslim resistance and a cycle of retaliatory executions, because the immediate military benefit of being able to march unencumbered seemed worth the cost. This calculus reveals something important about Richard's character. He was not the pious crusader of legend, fighting primarily for religious reasons. He was a professional warrior and ruler for whom the crusade represented a military and political opportunity. His faith was real, but it did not override his strategic calculations. When mercy and military efficiency conflicted, Richard chose efficiency without apparent hesitation. Richard in comparative context. To fully understand Richard's significance, it helps to compare him with other military commanders of his era. Saladin, his primary opponent, provides an illuminating contrast. Saladin was also capable of considerable brutality. After his victory at Hattin, he personally supervised the execution of captured Knights Templar and Hospitaller, whom he considered particularly dangerous enemies. Yet Saladin generally showed more restraint than Richard, often ransoming prisoners and showing mercy to defeated garrisons. This difference was not necessarily moral superiority. Saladin's position required him to maintain support across a fractious Muslim world, which meant demonstrating both strength and justice according to Islamic principles. Richard answered primarily to himself and to God, with less concern for broader political opinion. Their different circumstances shaped their different approaches to violence. Among Richard's European contemporaries, his military reputation was unmatched. Philip Augustus of France was a skilled strategist, but never demonstrated Richard's battlefield prowess. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor who died during the Third Crusade, had been a great warrior in his youth, but was elderly by the 1190s. Richard stood alone as the supreme military commander of his generation in Western Europe. Yet Richard's actual achievements as a king were modest at best. He spent perhaps 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. His fiscal policies drained the kingdom's resources. He produced no legitimate heir, setting up a succession crisis. He died at age 41 from an infection that might easily have been prevented, ending his reign just as he was consolidating power. His legend far exceeded his accomplishments. The Crusades in modern perspective. The modern historical reassessment of the Crusades has profoundly changed how we understand Richard and his era. Older histories, particularly those written in the 19th and early 20th centuries, tended to romanticize the Crusades as a clash of civilizations between Christian Enlightenment and Muslim barbarism. Richard appeared in these accounts as a hero bringing civilization to the savage East. Contemporary scholarship has thoroughly demolished this narrative. Historians now recognize the Crusades as violent colonial enterprises driven by a complex mixture of religious zeal, political ambition, economic opportunity, and military culture. The societies of the medieval Islamic world were in many ways more sophisticated, tolerant, and scientifically advanced than contemporary Christian Europe. The Crusades, far from being defensive wars, were aggressive invasions that caused immense suffering and left legacies of bitterness that still resonate in the modern Middle East. In this revised understanding, Richard appears less as a hero and more as a skilled military leader, serving an unjust cause. His tactical brilliance cannot be denied. He was genuinely one of the great battlefield commanders of medieval history. But his strategic goals were fundamentally about conquest and religious domination, pursued through methods that included massacre, destruction, and systematic violence against civilian populations. The impact of the Crusades on Christian-Muslim relations cannot be overstated. Events like the massacre at Acre became part of the historical memory of both civilizations, shaping attitudes for centuries. When modern conflicts erupt in the Middle East, the language of crusade and counter-crusade still appears, demonstrating the enduring psychological impact of these medieval wars. Conclusion. The man behind the legend. Richard the Lionheart remains one of history's most fascinating and controversial figures. The legend that has grown around him, the noble crusader, the perfect knight, the king who embodied medieval chivalry, has obscured the reality of a complex, flawed, and often brutal ruler. The real Richard was simultaneously admirable and appalling, a military genius who could order mass executions without apparent remorse, a charismatic leader who inspired fierce loyalty, and a calculating politician willing to sacrifice almost anything for military success. The massacre at Acre, whether of 2,700 or the mythical 50,000, reveals the dark side of Richard's character and the crusading movement more broadly. It demonstrates how religious fervor and military necessity could combine to produce atrocities that shocked even medieval contemporaries. It shows how dehumanization of religious enemies could override moral restraints and make the unthinkable seem acceptable. Yet Richard's story also reveals the complexities of judging historical figures by modern standards. Medieval warfare was brutal by nature. All commanders committed acts we would consider atrocities. and the context of religious warfare intensified existing tendencies toward violence. Richard was a man of his time, shaped by a culture that celebrated martial prowess and saw holy war as the ultimate expression of Christian duty. In the end, Richard the Lionheart stands as a warning about the dangers of mythologizing historical figures. The legend obscures the reality, making it difficult to learn the real lessons of history. Richard was not a hero or a villain, but a human being, capable of great achievements and terrible cruelty, driven by ambition and faith in equal measure. Understanding him requires acknowledging both the military brilliance and the moral darkness, the genuine courage and the callous pragmatism that defined his reign. The Holy Land campaign that made Richard famous ultimately accomplished little. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The Crusader states he strengthened would fall within a century. The great armies he led and the fortresses he built would crumble into dust. What endured was the legend and the historical memory of violence, a reminder that military glory often comes at a terrible human cost. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from the life of Richard the Lionheart. That fame and achievement in warfare should never blind us to the suffering such conflicts cause or the moral questions they raise about the use of violence in pursuit of religious or political goals.